I'm really aiming, first of all, to tell the story of church history. And no one can actually be an expert on 2,000 years of church history. I am certainly not an expert on 2,000 years of church history, not even on American history, I'm an expert maybe on one person in church history, and with admirable restraint, I did not even pick that person for this class, John Witherspoon. So I am not attempting to get the whole global church. We're going to talk about missions today. We'll try to hit a little bit throughout this semester, and almost all focused on Protestants, though I think I will do one Eastern Orthodox and one Roman Catholic, so stay tuned for who those will be. And I am not just doing people that we would find to be heroes, though mostly I'm doing people that we can emulate. But in previous classes, I did Pope Boniface VIII, who is a terrible, terrible pope. Even the Catholics recognize, yep, that was really bad. Dante, you had to read Dante's Inferno probably in class sometime. Dante was roughly a contemporary with Pope Boniface. Dante, of course, is a very devout Catholic, and he has Boniface and two other contemporary popes in hell. So we're in good ground for saying that was a bad pope. So we're not just doing heroes in this class, and you'll see along the way which ones we're looking at, but trying to tell the story and understand what God has been doing, and the church, which is very broad and very wide, especially as we move into these centuries. Somewhat had the advantage of being a little more narrowly focused, because for so much of church history, especially since the rise of Islam in the 7th century, Christianity was relatively narrowly confined to Europe, and in particular to Western Europe, and so you're focusing by necessity there. What you'll hear today is when we come to the end of the 18th century, we see this massive global diffusion of Christianity. Let me mention a book, and I'm glad I see one of the authors here, Introducing World Missions, 2nd edition. Scott Moreau, Gary Corwin, Gary McGee. This is 10 years old?
The first edition came out in 2004.
I think this is 2015 maybe, the 2nd edition. So one of our very own, Gary Corwin, is one of the authors. So this is a great textbook, and don't let that word scare you. It has pictures and glossy pages. Introducing World Missions. It's not mostly history, but there is some section on history and overlaps with some of the things that we're looking at today. So go out and order this book. Today we are talking about, drum roll, William Carey. Who was William Carey? Well, we'll come to him in just a moment, but let me set the stage. So William Carey, as we'll learn, is often hailed as the father of the modern missionary movement. And as we'll see, it's not as if there weren't missionaries going out before him, or that he was the first one to have any sort of missionary vision, but you can fairly say, in particular for Protestants, that William Carey marked in his life a turning point where Protestants became much more aggressive and enterprising in this task of world missions. In the first 2.5 centuries after Luther, the famous date, if you have to date the start of the Reformation, 1517 is when he famously nailed those 95 Theses, which was not a revolutionary act in itself. That's what you did when he put those 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. It was a way of initiating a debate. It was very much like Luther published a blog, or he had a podcast, or he published an article. It was a way of saying, let's talk about these things. But if you date the beginning of the Reformation to 1517, and I think it was in the 1520s where the term Protestant first began, Like so many terms, it originated as an insult from someone else. That they said, who are those people who are protesting? And so they became Protestants. Just like Methodists didn't say we're Methodists, but people said, you're so Methodistical. The Puritans didn't raise a flag and say, please call us the Puritans. It was an insult. So these Protestants, so you think of the early part of the 16th century until William Carey is born 1761. So 250 years. In the first 2.5 centuries, after Luther's 95 Theses, there was relatively little to show by the way of Protestant missionary success or even missionary enterprise. There were some notable exceptions. One notable exception, Calvin sent a team of people to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Do we have any Brazilians here? All right. Sent a team of Protestants in the 1550s to Brazil. And we can't be sure, but likely, and I think it was 1556, 1557, that was probably the first Protestant worship service in the New World ever. Now, what happened? Well, one of the men who was a part of the team either reverted back to Catholicism or secretly was Catholic all along and led an insurrection and wiped out the Protestant missionaries. And it was a very ill-fated attempt to establish a Protestant beachhead in the New World. So there were some small attempts like that. German pietists sent off some missionaries, especially among those who were German-speaking. So this is what you would find in many of these 2 centuries here. If there were missionary efforts, it was thinking, well, Germans have spread out to various places, so we need to go and send some missionaries to help those German speakers. The King of Denmark, King Frederick IV of Denmark and Norway, tried to provide Christian workers in South India. So and we'll see here with William Carey that we can give thanks to the country of Denmark because it was under the Danish flag that William Carey and the 2 men that he connected with were able to establish a mission. And it was much more conducive than under, say, the East India Company or even under the British Commonwealth. So King Frederick IV, the Moravians often showed a consistent missionary zeal. If you not familiar with that term, that's okay, but these were also somewhat descendant from the German pietists. And then in America, 2 men who we'll see were inspirations for William Carey are John Eliot. If you're saying, yeah, was he married to Elizabeth Elliot? No, off by a few centuries. Different Eliot. He died in 1690, and David Brainerd, 1718 to 1747. It's amazing, especially among Presbyterians, when you read about this missionary impulse, so many of them mention David Brainerd. Now, you can see his dates. Well, I know over here it's hard to read. 1718, 1747. You do the math. He was a young man. He became famous. Here's one of the keys in your life. If you want to be famous, have a more famous person write about you. So Jonathan Edwards wrote a biography of David Brainerd. And it was in Edwards' lifetime one of the most popular things that he wrote. Now, here's the other secret. If you want someone more famous to write about you, you have to fall in love with that famous person's daughter. So it was what David Brainerd did. So he stayed in Edward's home. He wrote about him. They never were married. He died before that. And John Eliot, David Brainerd, what were they missionaries for? They were missionaries among indigenous people, the Native Americans, Indians here in America, and William Carey took inspiration. So there were people in these centuries who did see the need to bring the gospel to those who had little to no access to it. It isn't as if the offspring of the Reformers did not care about reaching the lost. However, to be fair, the Roman Catholics were about 2 centuries ahead of Protestants in terms of aggressive missionary endeavors, especially this group you may have heard of, the Jesuits. The Jesuits were sometimes in charge of the Inquisition. The Jesuit order folded and then was set aside, and then it was reestablished. But especially with the Jesuits, there were many endeavors of Roman Catholics who were trying to spread the Roman Catholic faith. Now, why weren't Protestants doing the same thing that Catholics were doing? Well, there are a number of reasons. One, Protestants were often jockeying with each other to try to determine denominational supremacy. And you say, well, boy, why couldn't the Protestants get their act together? Well, one of the reasons that they couldn't is because they often had to deal with hostile monarchs and were trying to just navigate in their own land whether they could exist. It was greatly helped if you had, say, Spain, for example. Spain never received the Reformation. Spain, Portugal, the peninsula there, about the only place in Europe that never received the Reformation. And I've talked about this with people I know from Spain or even Mexicans, of course, of Spanish descent once upon a time. Say it is an amazing thing in the Spanish-speaking world that the Reformation is in some ways just reaching the Spanish-speaking world within our lifetimes. The Reformation did not get a foothold in Spain. So when you have a place like Spain, which is reliably, dominantly Roman Catholic, that allows the kind of freedom and the resources of the crown to send out. So the Protestants were often having to deal with the shifting tides of whoever the monarch was, and even if they were Protestant, maybe they were this kind of Protestant or that kind of Protestant, and it led to Protestants being much farther behind in missions. And then the Protestants, as they fanned out across the globe, and in particular if we think about those English-speaking Protestants coming here to this wilderness, they didn't have the resources or the wherewithal to think about global missions. They're trying to survive in the thick woods of the Carolinas, all these Scots Presbyterians who came here. And you find this around the world today. You have to have a certain amount of stability, economic vitality, a sort of settledness in order to start thinking, or at least often, is to start thinking about going out to those who have never heard. So for much of these 2.5 centuries, Protestants were thinking about how do we carve out a space here for ourselves in Western Europe or in the colonies of Western Europe, and maybe if there's an evangelistic impulse, it's to get a little bigger footprint where we are. But with the Christendom mindset, you're thinking all of our neighbors are a part of a parish. All of our neighbors are obviously a part of a church. Now, by the second half of the 18th century, so that means the 1740s, 50s, and onward, Protestants began to look outward in new and remarkable ways. And you think about what you all know now about church history, what would have been a major impetus? Why would it be that by 1740s, 1750s, second half of the 18th century, Protestants are thinking, have a new kind of evangelistic fervor? Well, it certainly is some of the fruit of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening that came through not just the American colonies, but the British Empire and Germany, and it was a transatlantic phenomenon. So a generation or two after that, you have this zeal and this awareness that people need to be awakened, they need to be converted, they need to be born again. And certainly David Brainerd fits in there. The Moravians were also earnest in evangelistic efforts. So this same spirit was beginning to bear fruit in more substantial ways. In 1783, give you a couple of famous missionaries that likely aren't famous to most of us, but they should be. So one of these is George Liele. George Liele, likely, and missiologists, historians debate this, but you could make a very good case that George Liele is the first American Christian to intentionally go to another land in order to witness to Christ. You could say he's the first American-sent missionary. He's an African American. George Liele was a former slave turned Baptist preacher who landed in Jamaica. Now, when we think of Jamaica today, we think of, well, they speak English. It's hard for us to understand their English. We're hard to, a very different culture. You have to remember that the West Indies at this time were a part of a British Empire that would have been more similar than different, certainly differences, but more similarities. So it was cross-cultural, and it was also a part of the larger British Empire. He went to Jamaica, the first Baptist missionary from America to another land. He landed there in 1783. In the same year, David George, also African American, also a former slave, also a Baptist preacher. He went, instead of going south into the West Indies, he went north to those people who most needed the gospel, the Canadians. He went to Nova Scotia, again, part of the British Empire. Nova Scotia, New Scotland, is often seen as a destination place. Hey, if you like cold islands, Scottish people, try Nova Scotia. So he went, and then in 1792, David George, with some others, went to Sierra Leone in West Africa, where he labored for almost 2 decades in evangelism and pastoral ministry. So a decade before, and we'll get to William Carey's timeline, but a decade before William Carey here in America, you do have these former slaves turned Baptist preachers. So William Carey does not get all the credit. Nobody was thinking about missions before him. Of course, that's not the case. But it is the case that David George, he lands in Sierra Leone in 1792. And a year later, in 1793, a work was published which would have an outsized influence in the missionary movement and is continuing today. It was written by a short, bald man. You don't have to raise your hand if you resemble that remark. A short, bald man in England published a modest pamphlet that would light a missionary flame among English-speaking Christians that, thankfully, has yet to be extinguished. And that man was William Carey. William Carey, as I said, was born in 1761 in a little village called Polersbury, England, a small village in Northamptonshire. Even today, the village isn't much more than 1,000 people. It was just a tiny hamlet. And Carey was born, this man who would launch the modern missionary movement among Protestants, the man who exhorted his fellow Christians with these famous words. Maybe you've heard this phrase before, comes from William Carey. Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. It's great. It would have been good on Twitter. Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. For much of Carey's life, it did not seem as if he was destined for great things. One of the themes in the previous classes we found is that, especially if we looked at the early church in the medieval period, almost everyone, like 95% of the people we looked at, were born into tremendous privilege. Now, Not using that as a bad word, just as a factual observation. And it makes sense. Until recently, most of the world was illiterate. So if we're talking about someone 1,500 years later, 1,000 years later, and we're reading their works, it means that that person was very likely a man, because they were the ones who would have had access to education, and probably born into a very well-to-do family, and especially precocious, and had opportunities that 99% of the other people didn't have. If we're still reading their works, it means they were likely educated, they could read, they could write. So almost everyone that we've looked at, born into, most of them into wealthy families, wealthy for the time. As we get to the modern period, and with the rise of the universities, which is the 1300s, before that, if you wanted an education, it was mainly attached to the monasteries. You could be a monk, or you could send off your sons, kind of like a boarding school, to say, well, they're not really taking a vow to be a monk, but would you go and train them? That's where you got education. Out of that arises the universities, which is still a very, very small select subset of people. By the time of Luther was born into what we might call middle class. So was Calvin. I didn't have a middle class like we have it, but sort of that. They still had fathers who were connected to the church in some way. But as we get farther now, and education becomes more available, at least to men, and there are more universal accommodations, we find that many of these people now were born into relative poverty or working class, or as we just saw with George Lyle and David George, they were slaves who became missionaries. So William Carey was not born into a famous, well-to-do family. His father was a weaver, and William's first job was with shoes. He was definitely not rich. He did not have formal schooling past age 12. He did not come from a well-connected, well-known family. And when I say short, he was 4'6", which was, don't judge, but he was short, and people were shorter then, but that was still really short, 4'6" for a man, and he was bald. He did not look the part. You would not have picked him out of the crowd, like Saul, who was a head taller than all the others. You would not have said, that guy is ready to change the world. He was, like almost everyone, born into the Anglican Church, that is the state church of England, but at age 18, he left, here's the term, he left for a dissenting church, or sometimes they're called non-conformist. Say, I always knew I was a non-conformist. Simply means not Anglican. So if you're a dissenting church in England, you are a part of one of the churches that dissents from the state church. And by this time, there is toleration, but you still are absent certain privileges if you're not a part of the state church, or nonconformists, because they're not conforming to, say, the Book of Common Prayer or to the religion of the king. So the dissenters would be usually Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists. Methodists, remember, initially was a branch, they were all Anglicans, but that will become later its own denomination. So he leaves, and Carey becomes a Baptist. Not long after, in 1781, he marries Dorothy, often called Dolly. So he marries his wife, Dolly Plackett. By the next year, Carey began preaching every other week, splitting his time as a cobbler, so doing odd jobs and working with shoes, and as a pastor. In 1781 or 85, he was turned down for ordination, so have no fear. You could be the next William Carey. But the church let him keep preaching on a trial basis as he honed his skills. It took him 2 more years to be officially ordained. And in 1789, he assumed the pastorate at a Baptist church in Leicester in the Midlands. I did my PhD at the University of Leicester, which is not, when Americans go to the UK, I've never met anyone who says, I'm going to go visit Leicester. And if you think you are, you pronounce it as Leicester, but it is pronounced Leicester. So he was a Baptist pastor there in the Midlands. He was a Calvinist. He believed in unconditional election, in the need for sovereign grace if sinners were to be converted. He also possessed an indefatigable zeal for the unconverted. He looked around at Reformed Baptists, and they would have been called particular Baptists. Those were the Calvinist Baptists. They were a particular kind of Baptist. He looked around and he thought, why don't I see more energy and zeal to take the gospel to the heathen? Now, that's not the way we talk today, but that's the way they all talked, to bring it to the heathen. In 1786, he began publicly advocating for a missionary society. When Carey proposed the idea at a gathering of the particular Baptists, one minister is reported to have said, when Carey is saying, we need a missionary society, we need to bring the gospel to the heathen, one minister said, young man, sit down. You are an enthusiast. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he'll do it without consulting you or me. So there were some among those particular Baptists who, again, they didn't call themselves this, but the phrase, they're hyper-Calvinists. Now, that's not referring to the children in my home. They're a different kind of hyper-Calvinist. And sometimes people throw that term around to just, if you seem too Calvinist, you're a hyper-Calvinist. But historically, this term, historians use to refer to those Calvinists who reach the conclusion, wrongly, but reach the conclusion that if God is sovereign, he is, and if he saves his elect according to his own purposes, he does, then he doesn't need to consult you or I, you or me. So the hyper-Calvinists did not believe in the free offer of the gospel, and they were often very passive when it came. They figured, now, do they want people to be saved? Yes, God will do it in his time, in his way. And what I mean by the free offer of the gospel, hyper-Calvinists would say, when I preach, hopefully you hear the gospel one way or another almost every Sunday, to say, come to Christ, believe in Christ. If you believe in Christ, you'll be forgiven of your sins. That's the free offer of the gospel. It's extended to everyone. Hyper-Calvinists said, well, if they're not, how do you know they're not elect? Maybe they're reprobate. Maybe God predestined them for hell, and so you shouldn't be so free. How do you know? Now, that's a wrong deduction from Calvinist theology, just as it was a wrong deduction to say we don't need to be concerned about missions. But these were some of the Calvinists surrounding William Carey. And this rebuke prompted Carey to study the issue more closely and put his thoughts on paper. And the result was a modestly sized book, pamphlet really, republished. Actually, it's going to be republished, I think, later this year, maybe the beginning of next year. And I've written a foreword for it, just putting some of this biography into the foreword. It has this very catchy title, An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens, in which the religious state of the different nations of the world, the success of former undertakings, and the practicability of further undertakings are considered by William Carey. See, they didn't have publicists, they didn't have dust jackets, they had to get, so you had long titles, because you got to get, what's this book about? You got to get everything into the title. That's what it was about. You can go Google it later and find it any number of places and read it on the internet. It's maybe 80 pages. There's nothing fancy about the book. You'd have to really hunt for a few different sections and paragraphs to be inspired. It's a lot of tables of, well, there are this many Christians, there's this many Muslims, there's this many people. Pages and pages of tables and what religion they practice. What made the tract influential was not those tables and the data. But the basic message, which said, we are commanded to go into the world and preach the gospel. The whole world hasn't heard the gospel, so why aren't we going? Carey's central theological argument was that the Great Commission was still binding. Now that may seem strange to us. You've probably heard sermons on Matthew 28 and the Great Commission more than maybe any other text in your whole life in the church. But there is a long tradition, and it's not as silly as it sounds. There's a long tradition of thinking that the Great Commission was fulfilled in the age of the apostles. You say, what? But the whole world wasn't converted? All the nations hadn't become disciples? Yes, but we could go and see several times where the language is used about the gospel went out to the whole world. There is the language of the cosmos. So there is a sense within the lifetime of the apostles, the world as they saw it, which was really around the Mediterranean basin, the Roman Empire, the world as they saw it, the gospel had gone to the four corners of the Roman Empire, or close to. So many theologians thought, well, the Great Commission has been fulfilled. And there's a sense in which an aspect of it, we might say. And yet Carey was right to point out and argue that, well, how can it be fulfilled? The promise is to be with you to the end of the age. We're not to the end of the age. And so if that promise endures, then the commission must still endure. And if somehow the Great Commission was just fulfilled, wrap it up, then all of those who have gone to the heathens before did so without biblical warrant. Way back in the first semester of this class 3 years ago, showed you likely the first Christian to really put these scriptures together, besides Paul, but to put these scriptures together and say, we must take this gospel to heathen, pagan people beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, was St. Patrick. There's a good reason to celebrate St. Patrick. You don't need to wear green. If you're Protestant, you can wear orange. You don't need to drink. He was the first one, and he saw, because the Irish, we got some Irish here, you don't have to claim it if you don't want to, but the Irish were considered absolute savages. Ireland had not been conquered by the Roman Empire. And of course, St. Patrick was not actually Irish. He was likely English, or maybe even Welsh is where his family probably was in today's, what is Wales. But he was captured by pirates, he was put as a slave, went to Ireland, escaped, and then in a dream was told to go back to those very people who had enslaved them and preach the gospel. So it's not that people hadn't done this before. William Carey said, well, if the Great Commission is fulfilled, how do we justify these men who have gone to the nations before? No, the teaching here is not restricted to a certain age. Particularly compelling, and this is very relevant, was Carey's response to the familiar retort, which he had in his day, and you will hear sometimes in our day, that says, well, missions is what you do in your neighborhood. Aren't you all surrounded by people who need the gospel? So we're all missionaries. Well, how can, there may be people far off who need Jesus, but you have people right next door who need Jesus, and that ought to be our concern. You may have heard that sort of before. Here's what Carey says. It has been objected that there are multitudes in our own nation and with our own immediate sphere of action who are as ignorant as the South Sea savages, again, not PC, and that therefore we have work enough at home without going into other countries. It was probably 20 years ago, not in the PCA, my former denomination. I knew and I grew up, my parents worked for missionary radio, so we've always had a mission impulse in our home, and Dad's been to 80 different countries, and we always had missionaries stay with us, and sometimes we had people from other countries stay with us for weeks or months at a time. So this has always been a burden of ours. I remember it was with great sadness, one of the largest churches in our area had shifted all of their global missions into local church planting. You say, well, aren't we for local church planting? Of course we are. We're doing some of that here. In their mind, it was mission is all the same. And in fact, maybe it's just sort of colonialism or imperialism. They probably have the resources to go reach their own people. And so, yes, for missions and all of that, they were putting just into their local missions. Don't we have enough need around us? William Carey was dealing with that same objection. He said, it's true, there are thousands in our own land as far from God as possible. I readily grant. And this ought to excite us to tenfold diligence to our work, and in attempts to spread divine knowledge amongst them, this is a certain fact. But that it ought to supersede all attempts to spread the gospel in foreign parts seems to lack proof. And here's the key. Carey says, our own countrymen have the means of grace and may attend on the word preached if they choose it. They have the means of knowing the truth, and faithful ministers are placed in almost every part of the land whose spheres of action might be much extended if their congregations were but more hardy and active. But with them, that is foreign parts, the case is widely different. They have no Bible, no written language, no ministers, no good civil government, nor any of those advantages which we have. Pity, therefore, humanity, and much more Christianity, call loudly for every possible exertion to introduce the gospel amongst them. Carey was not using this language, but in the last 50 years, this has become common terminology to distinguish between the reached and the unreached. You hear that language sometimes, unreached people groups or unengaged people groups. It's an inexact term. Some people use a certain metric. Well, if there's fewer than 2% evangelical Christians, well, by that standard, Scotland is an unreached people group. And others use, well, do they have an indigenous church and a language and a Bible? So there's different ways, but the distinction here is important, and Carey is hitting upon it. He says, yes, we ought to plant churches in our own land. Yes, let's evangelize. But these people, our neighbors, they all could go hear the gospel if they wanted to. Now, that may not be true in every single city in our country, but they can go and hear if they want to. They have opportunities. They could go on Amazon and get the best of Christian literature at their doorstep by Tuesday. They have access. Carey was saying there are people who, in his day, they didn't even have a Bible, they didn't even have a written language, they had never heard the name of Jesus. And there are still those peoples in the world today. Carey said, yes, let's labor in our own lands, but we have to go to those who have no access. So the numbers change a bit, but you can safely say that right now, if every Christian on the planet, I mean the broadest definition of Christian, just somewhere in a sociological box, Christian, every Christian on the planet shared the gospel with every single non-Christian they know. So you think of every non-Christian in your life, and every non-Christian in every Christian's life, and they all sent a big text message to all of those people, and instantly, every single one of them became a Christian. Oh, amazing. There would still be more than 3 billion people who are not Christians. They don't know any Christians. No Christian knows them or has access yet to them. So the state of the need is still very great, and it was just as great or greater in William Carey's day. He said at the end of his pamphlet, "What a heaven will it be to see the many myriads of poor heathens, of Britons among the rest." Now see what he did there? We got some poor heathens here too, who by their labors have been brought to the knowledge of God. That was his vision. By the end of 1792, the Baptist Missionary Society was formed. In June of the next year, Carey and his family left for India as the Society's first missionaries. On November 11, 1793, Carey landed on India's east coast in Calcutta. Carey spent 41 years in India, never returned to England. Now, I'm glad that we have the ability now to have furlough and home assignments and keep in contact. I mean, often in their day when you went, you literally packed your casket with you. I'm not coming back. 41 years, never to return to England. The British colonial government in India, so part of the British crown, was not welcoming of missionaries. And the East India Company looked down on their arrival even more. In British-controlled cities like Calcutta, Carey was constantly in danger of hostility or deportation. By 1800, he moved 16 miles north to a Danish colony. So here, cheer on 3 cheers for the Danes. The Danish colony of Serampore, just 16 miles north, and that's where he would receive greater freedom and protection. There he was joined by 2 other English missionaries, Joshua Marshman and William Ward. So together, Carey, Marshman, Ward became known as the famous Serampore Trio. And before long, Carey baptized his first Indian convert, a man named Krishna Chandra Pal. The work of the Serampore Trio was multifaceted. They started educational institutions, boarding schools at first for both boys and girls in separate schools, and then they started Serampore College in 1819. You can go Google and see a picture of Serampore College. It looks like a very impressive neoclassical Western building. The college opened with 37 students, 19 Christians, 18 non-Christians. It offered instruction in Sanskrit, Arabic, and English. In 1826, Marshman met with the King of Denmark and secured a royal charter for the college, making Serampore College the first degree-granting institution in Asia. The trio worked to abolish the practice of sati. You've heard of this before. In India, that's the practice whereby widows were expected to burn themselves to death on their husband's funeral pyre. It was expected as an aspect of their grief and their mourning that they would throw themselves and commit suicide at their husband's death. And the Christians said, this is barbaric. Crucially, over many years, the trio labored extensively in Bible translation. They completed 6 translations of the whole Bible, along with 23 completed New Testaments, portions of the Bible in 10 other languages. Carey himself translated the Bible into Bengali, Sanskrit, and Marathi. We'll come back at the end with some of his other accomplishments. So it is for good reason that Carey is often hailed the father of the modern missionary movement. Now, he wasn't the first one to take the gospel to another land in the modern age, but following Carey was this great swelling of missionary endeavor. Henry Martyn in India, Robert Morrison in Canton Province, David Livingstone in Sub-Saharan Africa, Hudson Taylor later in inland China, Adoniram Judson to Burma, Samuel Zwemer, which we might get at the very end of the class, Sean says, Samuel Zwemer in Arabia and Egypt, dozens and hundreds, if not thousands of missionaries inspired by Carey. Just a few words about some of these missionaries that would come in particular in the 19th century, which is hailed as the great missionary century. Henry Martyn was an English chaplain for the East India Company. He died at 31. He wanted to see India change, just as the Serampore Trio was working in other parts of India. And he saw much that would happen even in his short life as he labored, especially focused on Muslims and translations for Muslims. He was influenced by Charles Simeon, who was the longtime pastor at Holy Trinity Church in Cambridge. You can see there what an influence that a pastor can have or parents can have, that even if you don't go, it was said that Charles Simeon had his children as princes in all the lands. Robert Morrison was a Scottish companion of Carey. He eventually settled in Canton Province, devoted his life to translating the Bible. He saw very few converts. In fact, that's one of the things with so many of these men is that they actually saw very few converts, but they did translation, they established institutions, they had enough of a beachhead that the work could outlast them. Hudson Taylor to the interior of China Inland Mission. Hudson Taylor was the one who pioneered faith-based fundraising. What you can think what's good or unnecessary about it, but it was we just going to pray and the money will come in. We just believe in faith that the fundraising will come to us. What was so remarkable about Hudson Taylor, not only that he adopted traditional Chinese dress, but that he went to inland China. Along the coast is where there was greater protection, greater Western influence, and he went into the interior. Adoniram and Ann Judson, American missionaries to Burma, memorialized in a wonderful book. You want a great book to read sometime. It might be 400 pages. It's well worth reading. It's well written. To the Golden Shore, which is the story of Adoniram Judson. And then Samuel Zwemer, who apart from my own prodding, Sean said he wanted to do Samuel Zwemer perhaps at the end of class, often called the apostle to Islam. I have a special place in my heart for Samuel Zwemer because he was born in Friesland, Michigan, not too far from where I grew up, outside of Holland, Michigan. He's actually a graduate of Hope College, where I went to college. There's a little cottage called Zwemer Cottage there at Hope. The number of people at Hope who know why it's called Zwemer Cottage approximates 0. No doubt the most famous British missionary in the 18th century, after William Carey, was David Livingstone. He was born in a working-class family in Glasgow. So just a few things before we end by rounding out Carey's life. David Livingstone, he was Scottish. He was born in a working-class family in Glasgow. He was always interested in everything. He loved science, he loved exploring, he loved languages. He's often hailed as a missionary. Use the term very loosely. He was probably, first of all, an explorer. He was a doctor. He was a naturalist. He was a geographer. He was an abolitionist. He believed the best way to finally eliminate slavery was to eliminate the slave trade in Africa. He said, we're not going to finally get rid of slavery until we go to the root here and we get rid of the slave trade in Africa. His aim was to bring commerce, civilization, and Christianity to sub-Saharan Africa. And yes, many of these missionaries saw those as all part of the same package: commerce, civilization, and Christianity. His aim was also to end the slave trade, as he saw it, until they had a mechanism for greater commerce and greater economic stability. They wouldn't, by just altruistic motives, get rid of slavery. They needed to make slavery not profitable. In his many years in Africa, he only made one known convert, a Bakwena chief, what today would be Botswana, named King Sechele, Sechele. And a bit controversial too, because one of the main things with missionary work in Africa, especially if you're with these chiefs, they were almost all polygamists. And so polygamy was not Christian. And later this king reverted back to polygamy and was excommunicated. It seems that his Christian faith was genuine, and he was a genuine convert, and that was one of the high places, to use the Old Testament language. But that created conflict later between he and David Livingstone. David Livingstone knew how to make a name. He popularized his travels by keeping a travel log. He published his experiences back home, and he became one of the most famous Brits anywhere in the world. You have to imagine, I mean, this is a time, this would be like, I don't know, if we finally make it, if Elon Musk were traveling Mars by himself. You would be very interested, Whatever you think of Elon Musk, give us the journals. What are you seeing? So this was like that. Nobody was going to make it. They were never going to see Africa. They didn't have pictures of it. They didn't have television. So to have these diaries and travel exploits made him a famous man. In the 1860s, David Livingstone set out to find the source of the Nile River, and he likely got lost, or at least people lost track of him, which led to the famous incident where rumors swirled that he was dead. The famous David Livingstone was dead somewhere in the African interior, and this prompted another enterprising man, a journalist for the New Daily Herald in New York, a Welsh-American soldier in the Civil War, part explorer, part writer. His name was Henry Stanley. I bet he had a big, heavy cup with him to go search for David Livingstone. And when he, this was part publicity stunt for sure, but he encountered the Scotsman at a lake in Tanzania, and he uttered that question which all of you have heard 160 years later. You still probably know it. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? That was him. The missionary enterprise in the 19th century was not just carried out by men or by men and their wives. It was carried out by single women. Let me give you two examples before we finish with William Carey. One, Mary Slessor. She came from a poor Scottish home in Aberdeen. She was inspired by David Livingstone to sign up for missionary service. So after he died, she signed up and wanted to carry on the legacy in Africa. She arrived in the Presbyterian mission station in what is now Nigeria in 1876. She learned the local language. By 1880, she had her own mission. She gave religious instruction. She did not fancy herself a preacher or a pastor, but there was no one to give them instruction. Medical assistance. She looked after orphans. She opposed the Nigerian practice of twin murder. Twins were considered some sort of demonic curse, and so twins were put to death. She took in many orphans in her home. Like Hudson Taylor, she made the bold move to live like the people around her as much as possible. The one luxury she said she could not do without from her homeland was tea. She still drank tea. She identified with the Africans to such an extent, and this was very scandalous for the day, that she sometimes went out in public without her hat and without her shoes. In 1888, she moved further inland to minister to a violent people of the Okoyong territory. She was beloved by the Africans, respected by all for her integrity, her fearlessness, her spiritual vitality. One visitor called her, quote, a veritable white chief. And she was a committed Presbyterian, much more so than David Livingstone. His theology was pretty amorphous. Evangelical, but amorphous. She was a committed Presbyterian, and she ought to be remembered as one of the finest from our ranks, Mary Slessor from Scotland. And then to think of the Baptists. How many of you grew up in the Southern Baptist Church? Some of you? Did you ever have a Lottie Moon Christmas offering? So the rest of us may not know of the famous Lottie Moon. Charlotte Lottie, they called her Lottie Moon. She was born in 1840 into a wealthy, staunchly Baptist family in Virginia. She grew up on the family plantation. She was stirred in her faith by a student revival that swept through Charlottesville in 1858. And in 1873, she was appointed as a missionary to China with the Southern Baptists, one of the first single women to do so. She labored in Shantung province as an educator and evangelist. She too embraced local dress and local custom. She supported women's ministry in the region. During the Chinese-Japanese War in the 1890s, her house was bombed by the Japanese. In order to identify with the suffering Chinese, she fasted. She said, my people here are suffering and hungry. So she stopped eating, gave what little she had away. She left China in 1912, set sail for Japan, but she was sick, she was rail thin, she died aboard the ship. So that's a life worth remembering on its own, but the Southern Baptists among us, you're all Presbyterians now, but will know that her most lasting contribution stems from a letter that she wrote in 1888 asking for additional funds for her ministry in China. So, in honor of that letter in 1918, so 100 years ago, an annual Christmas offering was introduced among Southern Baptists for missionary work called the Lottie Moon Christmas Offering. And it has collected well over $1 billion. One historian has called it, quote, the most magnetic collection plate in mission history. We just have to be honest, Presbyterians, there are more Baptists here than us, and the Southern Baptists are the biggest, and they have the biggest missionary sending force in the world, and this Lottie Moon Christmas offering has given over $1 billion, if not billions of dollars to mission. So this was the great century, the 19th century. Even if conversions were sometimes few, translations were made, churches were planted, institutions were established. The mission statistician David Barrett gives us these numbers. In 1750, 22%, 1750, 22%, he estimates, of the world was Christian by some definition. 26%, so this is Christian, this is evangelized, 26% evangelized, and the scriptures in some 20 languages, 1750. By 1900, he estimates that 35% of the world was Christian, 51% had been evangelized, electric vehicle, and 537 scriptures in indigenous languages. So you can see this great century, these 150 years, what remarkable work was done in the world. And Carey stood as one of the sources, the fountainheads. We are right to consider Carey a hero of the faith, but we need to realize he was a real person and he was flawed. Carey often struggled with feelings of isolation and loneliness. He was deeply aware of pride in his heart. He often commented, now some of this was the way you wrote at the time, but you can read his letters or diary. He often spoke how his heart was dead and lifeless. He didn't feel like a great Christian. Most painfully, Carey did not have a close relationship with his wife. He was not sensitive to her fears and desires. It's really one of the great sadnesses in church history is that William Carey, who undeniably did amazing things, and his wife suffered tremendously for it. She lived a difficult life. She was 5 years older than Carey. She always seemed to be pregnant, in poor health, often both at the same time. She did not want to go. The work that Carey was so passionate about, she wasn't. It's not that she didn't care, but she didn't feel called to it. She was seasick on the way to India. Once in Calcutta, she got dysentery. Her sister, who was really her traveling companion, her friend, she died. Later, their 5-year-old son, Peter, died, plunged her into a deep despair. She was never happy. At times, she expressed profound anger. Probably today, she would be labeled as having mental illness. She was moved even to the point of violence against her husband. And she suffered from the ill treatments of the day. They diagnosed her with paranoia. And what would a good doctor say? You're depressed, you're paranoid. They recommended that she should have another pregnancy. That'll snap you out of your delirium. From time to time, the treatment was called that she was confined to her room with only her children allowed to see her. She died December 8, 1807, possibly from mercury poisoning, which was often used to treat dysentery. 6 months later, William Carey married Lady Charlotte von Rumor. Now, if that sounds like a step up in terms of class, it was. She was the daughter of a Danish count. She was fluent in several languages. She was extremely wealthy, and the marriage was a scandal. Your wife died 6 months later. You marry this wealthy, elite socialite. But Charlotte proved well-suited for missionary work. She spent 13 happy years with William until she died. In 1823, he married his third wife, Grace Hughes. When Carey died, he left his library to Grace, and it's somewhat bittersweet. He asked to be married next to his second wife, Charlotte. So here we close. I have 1 minute left. What Carey accomplished is truly hard to fathom. He was an expert gardener. He discovered 3 varieties of eucalyptus. I mean, who among us hasn't? He founded the Agro-Horticultural Society in India 30 years before the Royal Agricultural Society was established in England. He published the first books on science and natural history in India. He helped develop indigenous paper in India. He's considered by some to be the father of modern printing and publishing in India. He established the first newspaper printed in an Oriental language. He introduced savings banks, lending libraries, astronomy. He worked for the humane treatment of lepers. He taught linguistics. He published, this is interesting, Sanskrit editions of Indian classics, even Hindu classics. About the time the United States was celebrating a postage stamp in honor of Elvis, India issued a stamp commemorating the work of William Carey. He was a church planter most of all, and although he saw only a few converts, he was able to establish an indigenous church. So we cannot claim all the successes that would follow at William Carey. We must acknowledge his own flaws and failures, in particular to his wife. But there's no question his achievements inspired many. And his call to cross-cultural missions played a significant role in the great 19th century of global spread of Christianity. And so perhaps given his heroic efforts, it is fitting that his final epitaph highlights the grace of God for sinners. Here's what his tombstone reads. William Carey, D.D., born 17 August 1761, died 9 June 1834, a wretched, poor, and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall.